Welcome to week 3 of Old Testament Survey 2. I want to review what we talked about last week here in this video, and then down below will be an introduction video to the actual week 3. So think of this as the concluding video for week 2. Last week we talked about Exodus, and specifically we were talking about those two clips. That was the discussion board. What they got right, what they got wrong, and then I added to that a discussion questioning. It was a little bit up in the air, but essentially asking, can we teach these Bible stories without teaching everything in them? This goes to the question of, are the details important, and is every word important? Is it just the overarching story that's important, or is it how the story is told? I think that we need to be very careful when we're teaching the scriptures to tell the stories the way that the Bible tells them, and that is we recognize through the concept of inspiration, and especially if we're held to verbal plenary inspiration, that every word was inspired, and therefore that every word becomes important. Now, some words are obviously going to be more important than others as far as the context and all that, but how the story has been put together is a key element in trying to determine what the author is trying to get us to get out of the story. When we look at the Exodus event, the way that it's told, there are certain repetitions, there are certain areas of focus, there are certain themes and theologies that come out in the way that the story is told. So, for instance, if we're looking at the calling of Moses, the order of the questions is important. It demonstrates a humility in Moses, in the sense that the way he spoke was how a lesser party would be expected to speak to the greater party when being sent out on a mission, but also his absolute refusal at the end to go. God gets angry with him. And so that's something that has to be recognized as a key part of the story. The themes that come out in that story, the idea of knowing Yahweh, knowing who He is, this becomes a very, very important theme through the rest of the Exodus, especially the Exodus event itself. When we get to the plagues, which are not necessarily called plagues in the biblical account, but they're called signs. These are signs to demonstrate to the people, Israel and Egypt, who Yahweh is. You note when Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go, that they may go out to the wilderness and worship Yahweh." Pharaoh says a very important phrase. He says, "Who is Yahweh? I don't know him." And this becomes the theme of the Exodus event, and that by the time the Exodus event is over, Pharaoh and all of Egypt knows who Yahweh is. Not only that, but Israel knows who Yahweh is. And because they know who Yahweh is, then when you get into the second half of the book, starting right around chapter 20, when they're at Sinai, they get the Ten Commandments, and then the Book of the Covenant that comes after, and all that is this expectation of, now that you know who Yahweh is, now that you have this relationship with Him, this is how that relationship is going to be maintained, and this is what that relationship looks like and should look like. And then, of course, moving forward into Leviticus and then Numbers, we see more on that theme. If we look at Exodus from the point of view of the Abrahamic promise, this idea of seed, land, and relationship with God, as I mentioned last week at the beginning of the book, the promise of the seed is fulfilled. The Israelites are multiplying so much. There are so many of them that Egypt is afraid. Pharaoh is afraid because of their size. So the promise of the seed is taken care of. Now there leaves the question of the relationship and the land. And of course, they're going into the land, but that's not a key part of of the Exodus event. Well, the key part is this relationship. At the beginning, God is silent. And the question is, he seems to be working behind the scenes. By the end of Genesis, he's kind of faded into the background. He's only talked about, but he doesn't really show up and speak by the time we get to the Joseph story. In fact, we get Joseph saying to his brothers, "You meant this for evil, Yahweh meant it for good." But that's really the only... God's work is implied, but never explicitly demonstrated as far as, and then God did this, and then God did that. At the beginning of Exodus, the question is, does Yahweh still have a relationship with His people? And that's where you get that key phrase in the first, I think it's towards the end of chapter 2, it says, But God saw, he heard the cries of his people, and he remembered. And then that's when God steps back onto the stage in a grand way, appearing first to Moses, and then appearing through the signs to his people and to Egypt. And so the relationship aspect of that promise becomes the key focus in the book of Exodus. What does a relationship with Yahweh look like on both sides of that equation? How does Yahweh act in his relationship with his people and with the nations? But also, how are his people to act in that relationship as well? And by the time we get the Book of the Covenant and the so-called laws, which I think it's a bit of a misnomer here in the book, the term Torah doesn't mean law, it means instruction, and that's what we see. But we do see statutes. They are not there to get the people to earn their relationship with Yahweh or to save them, so to speak. And this is where the law of the Old Testament gets a bum rap sometimes, and that they have been saved already. The Exodus event is the salvific event, the salvific event par excellence of the Old Testament, and it is after that salvation that they are given the laws or the statutes and the ordinances, and they're given the Ten Commandments. What it is God has established a relationship with them and said, because you're in this relationship, because I have brought you out of Egypt, because I have saved you, therefore you need to do these things. In the New Testament, Jesus puts it this way: if you love me, obey my commandments. And that is the story of the covenant that's established at Sinai. Yahweh saying, if you love me, obey my commandments. And by the time we get to Deuteronomy, we're going to see that, and the term love is used over and over and over again with this sense of obedience. Love is demonstrated through obedience. It's not a way to earn salvation or to earn that relationship. That relationship has already been established. The salvific event has already been done by Yahweh, but now that relationship has been formalized, and people are shown they have a responsibility. In the New Testament writers say we still have a responsibility to obey Yahweh because he has loved us. The New Testament writers are saying that the law never was intended to save people. And they tell their audience, if you're reading it that way, you're reading it wrong. The Old Testament never ever teaches a salvation by law. Paul makes that very clear in Romans, but rather by salvation through faith. But just like in the New Testament and the Old Testament, if the people have a faith and love Yahweh, they need to obey his commands.